The Gulf crisis is getting personal. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt say they'll make their grievances against Qatar public. And those showing sympathy with Doha can be jailed. So what's the real human cost here? And what's the long-term impact? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. A violation of freedom of expression. That's what Human Rights Watch has called the crackdown by 3 Gulf countries against people who criticize them on social media. Bahrain has jailed one of its citizens for comments made online after it passed a law criminalizing expressions of sympathy with Qatar. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are threatening similar action as the diplomatic crisis in the Middle East grows. Together with Egypt, they've severed ties with Qatar, accusing it of supporting terrorism, a charge it vehemently denies. So let's look at some of the penalties being enforced by the 3 Gulf states against people expressing an opinion. In the UAE, social media users face 15 years in jail and fines starting at $136,000 for anyone sympathizing with Qatar. In Bahrain, criticizing the government's action against Qatar will see you spend 5 years behind bars and pay an undisclosed fine. And in Saudi Arabia, residents can also be sentenced to 5 years in prison for violating the country's cybercrime law, which bans material it considers is impinging on public order. All 3 countries have also blocked Al Jazeera online and on their television networks. Well, let's bring in our panel from London. Saeed Al-Shehabi, a Bahraini activist and leader of the Bahrain Free Movement. From Washington, D.C., Khalil, Jahshan, Executive Director of the Arab Center of Washington. And also from London, Saad Djebbar, an international lawyer. Very good to have all of you with us. I'm going to start off with you, Saeed Al-Shehabi, as a Bahraini activist, seeing what's going on in your country. Tell me what you're hearing about this clampdown.
Thank you very much. It is a sad story being repeated several times, the latest of which is that you must not show any sympathy to Qatar or Qataris. You must just treat them as anyone except brothers and friends and neighbors. You must not have any sympathy with Qatar. And if you show any sympathy through your Twitter account, through any statements, then you are liable to go to jail for 5 years. In fact, this is not a theoretical decree, but it is a realistic one, because we saw many of our activists are in jail because they criticized the Saudi war on Yemen, like Father Abbas, the president of the Wahdawi party, and then we have Nabil Rajab, the most prominent Gulf human rights activist. They have done nothing except to show a position different to that of the government and that of the Saudis with regards to the attack on Qatar, on Yemen.
And now, why can't they show sympathy for what's going on in Qatar? What's the problem for them?
Well, Qataris were our brothers until our rulers decided that they are no longer our brothers. So it is them, it is the ruler who decides who is your friend and who is your foe, who is your brother and who is your enemy. So we are just treated as pawns, as non-entities. That we are just pieces of furniture which are moved around depending on the taste and mood of the ruler. This is very, very sad situation. This is lower than the law in terms of human rights, in terms of feelings, human feelings, in terms of neighborhood rights. I mean, this is amazing. Qataris, Bahrainis, Saudis, they are all friends, brothers. They have intermarriages, same families on both sides of the borders. These fictitious borders must not be there. Yet they are not only accepting those fictitious geographical borders, but they are creating walls of hatred,
Okay.
walls of
I'm just
of
wondering what the
indifference to
legal
plight of
perspective,
others.
excuse me jumping in here, what the legal perspective is here, Saad Djebbar.
Well, these are draconian measures by all measure and standards in the world. I mean, in banning people not to express themselves the way they wanted, although they were not instigating hatred or violence, in saying, as you are hearing now, that you shouldn't have this embargo or you criticize any aspect of the embargo, you will find yourself jailed for up to 5 years in Bahrain, 15 years in the Emirates, and I leave it to your imagination in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So the gang of 4 states are well known for their repression and their arbitrary treatment of any opposite view or opposite voice. This is in total and blatant violation of all minimum standards of international law.
Khalil, Jahshan, is this the right response to what it sees Qatar doing, what it's accusing Qatar of doing, this clamping down of freedom of expression and extremely draconian measures?
Absolutely not. I mean, these countries are free to disagree with Qatari policies and to have some political disagreements over certain practices or policies, but to resort to these types of draconian measures, as they were just described, is unacceptable. It's basically a violation of basic practices and norms of international law as it pertains to civil rights and human rights. It's in total disregard to basic freedom of expression. And it's not going to necessarily serve the interest of these countries or their people in the long term. But also, aside from the civil and human rights, it doesn't jibe with the other practices that these countries have. It would be interesting to see, even in such abusive situations, to see some draconian measures like that, let's say vis-a-vis spying for Israel or undermining the security of the state in other forms.
I mean, it is extreme. So I'm just wondering, why do you think they have to go to these sort of measures? Is it taken from a position of strength, or are they frightened of their own citizens?
I wouldn't call that strength. I would call it intolerance. I would call it lack of respect for civil rights, lack of respect for the intelligence of their citizens, and simply, that is not strength as much as it is weakness. It's an inferiority complex.
And Saeed, we've got this happening at the same time that families are being ripped apart. And I'm just wondering how this is going to play out in a place like Bahrain, the sort of clamping down of freedom of expression, punishing their own citizens.
Well, the problem is that citizens do not matter at all. They have no values. They have no human rights. Only 2 days ago, 5 UN experts they attacked and criticized the regime of Bahrain for its lack of respect for human rights, its attack on freedom of expression, and banning and using excessive force against any protest. So these 5 experts, rarely they come together and issue a common statement, yet they were forced to do that because of what happened recently. Just 2-3 days before they decided to have this ban on Qatar, several of human rights activists, including a female, imagine a Bahraini female who is a human rights activist, was degraded, was assaulted sexually openly. And this is what was mentioned also. She told her story to Amnesty International. The problem is that they think that they own the country, they own the people, they own their minds, they own their feelings, their instincts, their emotions. And that doesn't help the situation in a region which is full of tension. Like they have been banned. They were asked not to show sympathy to the people of Yemen. It is more than 1,000 people have died because of the Saudi blockade of Yemen.
Okay,
and
so
we are
let's just bring
Qatar
in, if I
itself.
may, a reminder of what's going on at the moment and what human rights groups have to say. They've also accused Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Bahrain of violating human rights after ordering Qatari nationals to leave their countries and for their own residents to leave Qatar. Now, Qatar's National Human Rights Committee says more than 13,000 citizens from the three countries living in Qatar have been affected. The committee has received reports of at least 764 human rights violations since the blockade began almost 2 weeks ago. It's also received 155 complaints from mixed families who've been separated by the travel ban. Saad, what is the legal perspective on what is going on there, the stacking up of maneuvers against Qatar and the people living there? I mean, what can be done now to put a stop to this?
Well, the blockade against Qatar itself is one step short of war, and the cyber war we have been witnessing against Jazeera and other media who have the opposite view reflects exactly the internal situation of the three Gulf countries, I mean Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt. So this the internal policies are draconian policies and measures are reflected in the embargo, an embargo which has never been seen in modern history. Even the embargo against Libya, when Gaddafi was accused of involvement in the Panam, and in the atrocities
and stopping food and medicine coming in. I mean, it's not often you see something like that either. They never blockaded the vessels, or apart from aircraft and certain selective, let's say, sectors, the Libyans were free to move, or you are free to travel to Libya and from Libya. So these are really very unusual, and they have all characteristics of war. And let me say another thing, starting from the Gulf Cooperation Council Treaty itself. The three countries have violated it because they have violated the right of freedom of movement amongst the citizens of the Gulf countries, and they have violated the right of residence to the Qataris, and the right of ownership. So they treated the Qataris as if Qatar is no longer a member of the GCC. Let alone the violations of international, the right of freedom in belief and to exercise your own belief. Look at the treatment of the Qataris who are in Saudi Arabia, who are in Mecca and Medina on minor pilgrimage. The Saudis have violated the status of Mecca and Medina. They were acting as if they own the place. And I remember Colonel Gaddafi at one time, he said, Mecca and Medina status should be internationalized. And he said, the Saudis, we don't allow our pilgrims to go. We should switch and go to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And I will not rule out the possibility that if the Qataris asked to go to Al-Aqsa Mosque to visit and to practice their own faith, I'm sure the Israelis will not resort to same restrictive measures. I want to bring it back, Khalil, to the demands made on Qatar. Now, we heard yesterday that the Saudi foreign minister was saying that they're drawing up a list of demands. I mean, it seems extraordinary, doesn't it, that they don't even know what the list is. I mean, before you take these sort of measures, I would imagine that you would have your list of grievances set up weeks ago, months ago, possibly sent it to Qatar and deal with it that way.
Precisely, and with all due respect to my friend, the foreign minister, Saeed Al-Shehabi, with whom I've worked extensively when he was ambassador here in Washington, this is not, it's contradictory. I mean, how do you engage in a step that's virtually de facto war against a neighboring country when you don't have those excuses, if you will, or those charges leveled against that country, written, discussed, and approved in advance? To kind of make an excuse right now to simply delay the negotiating process, whether mediated through Washington or mediated through Kuwait or what have you, to make excuses by, hey, we're not ready, we haven't voted on these demands, we need to kind of get together and delay, that time and precious time indeed, while people are suffering and are deprived of their basic rights, doesn't make sense to me. They should have had that list, long time ago before they took these steps against Qatar.
It seems, Saad, that possibly Saudi Arabia and the other states involved had no idea that it would take this long, that they thought that with this sort of shock and awe, if I can quote a former president, tactic would work on Qatar, bring it to its knees, but the reverse has happened.
Well, Qatar will not capitulate because there are no demands. What are the demands of the other states? I'm sure they are taking so long to formulate the so-called grievances because they are waiting for public relations companies in the West, in Britain, in America, to prepare some sort of a spin in order to create some excuses based on wind. They have no basis for treating Qatar as if it was an enemy state and in a manner which only fit for Middle Age regimes. That's how in the Middle Ages states use, or less entities used to treat their enemy. And if you look, if you dismember, look at the anatomy of the so-called grievances, they wanted to force Qatar for a long time to accept the coup d'etat in Egypt and the military regime in Egypt. They wanted Qatar not to accept the people when they go to the streets and decide their own fate and topple dictatorial regimes like in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria. If you look at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they have spent a lot of money trying to undermine the positive side of the Arab Spring. They wanted to exclude certain forces from participating in the new democratic process and transition. They did that against Nahda in Tunisia, and they haven't spent a penny in Tunisia. They wanted to force Tunisia to not accept or to engage in democratization.
It would be a good idea if some of these nations condemning what's going on adds to the aid, send some money to help those struggling from these war-torn countries. I just want to hear from you, Saeed, about what you think Saudi Arabia wants from this. I mean, we've seen it in Bahrain before when Saudi Arabia sent in their tanks, keeping it vaguely occupied. Is that what they want for Qatar now? Do they want to rein it in, and how far are they going to go?
First of all, I like to bring the story of Jesus Christ when he wanted, when a woman committed adultery and they wanted to stone her. He said that I want someone who hasn't sinned, someone who without a sin to deliver the first stone. So who hasn't sinned among them? Is it only Qatar who is a sinner? All of them are perfect people? So this is number one. Number two, Qatar, of course, stood up along with the Arab Spring revolutions and supported and supported, at least in terms of media coverage, of course, except in Bahrain. They mediated to sort out the problem, and then now they are using that mediation against it. Why did you mediate? They are saying it is intervention rather than mediation, which was done with the agreement of the Bahraini regime. So yeah, it is pathetic. It is dirty politics. They want her to stop supporting or sympathizing with the oppressed people like Ikhwan Muslimin, the Brotherhood in Egypt. They want her to support the coup against an elected government. So I think they are not happy that Qatar is allied with Turkey, is probably not taking the same line, the same harsh line against Iran. Also, her line with Oman. I mean, the GCC is being fragmented by the Saudis themselves. They are bringing this only successful or relatively successful enterprise into disrepute by causing all these internal disputes unnecessarily and for no reason.
We'll talk about the GCC a little bit later on. Sorry, forgive me for interrupting again. Khalil, I just want to hear from you. I mean, we don't know what the demands what they will end up being. As far as concessions go, though, I mean, Qatar will have to listen to Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, haven't they? I mean, in certain areas, they do need to clean up their act and stop funding groups which are not accepted by these states.
Frankly, we do know what the demands are. There are so many lists, maybe not officially announced by Saudi Arabia as a government or the Emirates, but these lists have been circulated by people who are close to these governments within the propaganda war that is being waged against Qatar, whether online or by other means. So we know what these demands are. They really would like to bring Qatar to its knees in terms of total kind of obedience, if you will, to a common dictated foreign policy controlled either by Riyadh or by Abu Dhabi. That has been a problem for a long time, frankly. The GCC, just like any other regional organization, just like the UN, just like the EU, these are voluntary, in a way, organizations where members, first of all, by joining, do not surrender their sovereignty at the door. Two, they reserve the right to slightly differ on some issues, not vital issues threatening the security of the collective organization itself, but to maintain their own direction. And definitely Oman has done that. Qatar has done that. Kuwait has done that. And occasionally even Saudi Arabia and the UAE have done that. But now all of a sudden in the context of this deputization role that Mr. Trump has imposed on the Gulf with announcing Saudi Arabia, if you will, and the Emirates as the policeman of the region and telling them, you know, drive him out of your communities, drive him out of your mosques, drive him out of this world. What does he mean? Where do they go? I mean, there's only one world that we all share. I mean, where do you drive people out of this world? They're taking this green light, I think, from Washington too seriously in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. They need to slow down. They need to give other members of the GCC some room to maneuver, to maintain their sovereignty. So in that sense, the demands, with all due respect, are not going to be implemented regardless of who is mediating, whether it's the US, as I said, or Kuwait or any other.
Okay, let me bring Saad in now, if I may. Saad, how do you think this is going to be played out? I mean, it seems that Trump has handed over to Rex Tillerson to deal with it. That's probably not a bad thing. How do you make these demands without belittling Qatar? What does Qatar need to do to try and bring some stability back to this region?
Well, Trump doesn't read history. If he knows about the history, Qatar was always a strategic ally of the United States. Remember when the American base was, when the Americans were asked they were no longer welcome in Saudi Arabia, it was Qatar which offered them the military base facility. And secondly, they have to remember that in splitting up the GCC, you are giving a free hand to Iran and free price to Iran. And thirdly, they are acting exactly like when Saddam Hussein, a big country, invaded another country called Kuwait. And look what happened thereafter to Saddam. And thirdly, when you use fake facts and you so many lies in order to justify an invasion, and that happened to Saddam Hussein when the West or the Americans invaded Iraq on false basis when there was no such evidence. So history is repeating itself, albeit now at the hands of Arabs. And what is lamentable is to see Saudi Arabia, the Emirates and others adopting the same discourse of the Israelis regarding terrorism. And they are talking about terrorism in an abstract. They are treating, look, the fight in the Arab world is between two forces. Forces who are aspiring for change, for democratization, and forces which are trying to stop that train. Saudi Arabia and the Gang of Four are, or the gang, I call these Saudis and the Egyptians, the Bahrainis, and the four states who are engaged in the embargo as the Gang of Four. They are trying to act against history and against nature. And the train of change will victor at the end. And Qatar is being punished because it sympathized with the forces of change rather than standing in front of the train of change.
All right, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. It's clearly not going to be over anytime soon. Thank you very much for your thoughts, all three of you. To our guests, Saeed Al-Shehabi, Khalil, Jahshan, and Saad Djebbar. And thanks you two for watching. Quick reminder that you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com /AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. So from me, the rest of the team, goodbye. Thanks for watching.